Hey, 4 o'clock Grandmasters. How we doing? Mike from the WCA. Let's take a look at some of these G4 ideas that we looked at in class. I just want you guys to be aware that they occur in lots of different openings. So you guys actually played from the following position right here. And I'm going to show you what happened a little bit later on. However, keep in mind that this G4 pawn push comes lots of different places, lots of different structures. It's a real weapon. It almost always comes with a little bit of risk as well, because look at the white king in this position. Fortunately, all the minor pieces are still left. Actually, all the power pieces are still left on the board, so there's plenty of coverage. But without those pieces, be very careful with these pawn pushes. If the king were castled on the other side of the board, this would probably get you in a whole heap of trouble, because black would just pawn storm you and open you up. Okay, before we look at what happened at in the rest of the game that you guys played in, let me show you some openings. Here's the Caro-Kann, right? So in the Caro-Kann, just like in the French, we have the advanced variation, and that is usually followed up with bishop f5 by black. Their reason is bring the bishop out, and then the main line goes knight f3, and now black can play e6, creating this really solid pawn chain here with the bishop kind of skating outside that chain. That's the main line. However, over the years they came up with this cool idea where instead of playing knight f3, they would play the move knight c3, so it would be in this position. They throw out knight c3, and if black plays e6, which they can do, they can kind of get into the mainline stuff with knight f3, but with the queen on this line, you can actually throw out g4 here. This is actually one of the main lines of the Caro-Kann advanced variation. So look it up. If you're a Caro-Kann player, be prepared. You may get a wise guy with white who will throw this at you. Okay, that's the Caro-Kann after e4. Let's take a look at the Perk defense. d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, bishop e2. That's a sneaky move. The idea of playing bishop e2 is to keep control of this square, g4, twice. You have the queen and bishop battery because black has that square covered twice. So if black continues, and they're fine to do this with bishop g7, guess what? That's right, g4. Starting to see a pattern here. I had seen a game that continued h6, and beautiful game actually, and white in this position wasn't quite sure what to do after h6 because it slowed this down, and decided to temporarily play h3, which protects the space that this pawn gives you. So black countered with a strike in the middle. You should expect that. White pushed past, and then black castled. And as soon as black castled, white thought it was time to move the h-pawn twice, which is something that I want you birds to always remember when you have the white pieces. It's like having an extra tempo in the bank. So you just moved your h-pawn twice, but because you're playing white, maybe you can get away with that. And I'm just going to, I don't want to explain every move because we have a lot to look at in the other games, but this game continued with e6. So, black is trying to break this big center that white has, and then g5, pushing through in the middle. And at any point, you can stop this video and come into class with any of your own analysis if you think somebody may have missed something, which is possible. But the players exchanged on the h-file. The knight is attacked here on f6, so it went back, and then queen d3. What's the idea? I guess that's a queen lift. We all know about rook lifts. With queen d3, the idea is to sneak her over, not here, You have to watch out if this line opens up. But at the right moment, if you can come here, then you have mating threats. So that's really what queen d3 is all about. Pawn takes, opening up this bishop's diagonal, which stops queen to h3. Knight takes in the center. Knight c6 developing. And now queen g3. So as you can see, white is inching closer and closer to the promised land here. We want to get at this king. Bishop to e6, and in this position, black is completely lost. He thought after queen h4 that he would have a defense with the move f5. Well, turns out he does not. I'm going to leave this position on the board and put it in the blog for you to solve. This is white to play and do whatever. Okay, now let's take a quick second here and take a look at a Philidor defense. So e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4. Knight d7 is not the main line anymore. This is called the Hannum variation. There's an improved way to get into that, but we don't need to cover that here. But by transposition, this is the main position in the Hannum defense, in the Philidor. So guess what white can do here? Yeah, you guessed it, g4. It's been played a whole bunch of times. So, you know, add this to your arsenal. I would recommend just go over a couple of games and be aware of it from both sides of the board. Okay. Now let's get to where you guys played. And I want to show you the balance of the game that was played with Pia Krambling, really, really strong player with the black pieces. She ends up losing here. You know, it looked like she misplaced a couple of her pieces, and it's difficult, as I mentioned in class, to play these hedgehog positions. And by the way, our fearless leader, Rusa, had this same exact position on the board at one of her World Youth Championships. She actually had it much later in the game, so they followed theory to almost move 20. Anyway, if you guys started from here, you remembered the move bishop to c8, which I kind of hinted at class. And what bishop c8 does, it gives black an opportunity to redeploy the bishop this way. That's number one. Number two, it opens the d7 square. I learned this a long time ago. I don't remember from who, but they said when you go over Grandmaster games and you're confused about a move, like this one, you see a bishop back up to c8. If you're not 100% sure what the piece is doing from the new square, look at the square that it occupied. So a moment ago, this bishop was on the d7 square, and now all of a sudden that square is open. And you'll find that very often it's designed to open a square for a piece. Now remember, that d7 square was not just to get away from this pawn, but also after this rook moves, the knight has this nice little maneuver, d7, f8, knowing that white was going to attack the king side. So that's just a nice defensive maneuver to remember. Okay, white backs up the bishop. This is all theory. One of the reasons for that is to start clearing this diagonal for the queen. So again, if you were not 100% sure why a grandmaster would back up a piece, you know, what's it doing? Is it attacking h3? Well, not really. I don't think that's the main reason. It was already attacking these squares. So if you stop and think about it, really the only reason to back it up would be to clear that line. Black jumped back in anticipation of this move, g5, rook e8, again opening the f8 square, and here comes the attack, h5 with the queen. Now, these kinds of moves provoke moves like g6, which weaken the dark squares. But as we mentioned in class, it's okay. You gain the tempo on the queen, so in the game she backed up here to h4, but think of the possible resources that black has here. You have the move bishop f8 to cover the dark squares. You have the knight coming to f8 to cover the light squares. So as long as white can't pile up too much, black has the opportunity to put up a defense. Now, here, there is almost always going to be some sort of sacrifice by white if black holds these squares, because if they're holding the squares, then the only way to break through is you're going to have to give up one of your pieces for a pawn or two, which happens in this game. What black hopes to do in these hedgehog positions is, while white is busy organizing an attack, they eventually try to time breakthroughs like d5 or e5. Pardon me, not quite yet. Okay? That's what happened here. So the queen backed up to h4, and sure enough, bishop f8, covering those squares. Well, how to continue the attack for white? You can pause the video if you don't remember in class, because we kind of went fast at the end. But I really want you guys to pay attention to this game and the moves. Pause the video whenever necessary. Rook f3 was played. Pretty obvious why. That rook's going to swing over and start menacing the king. Bishop g7. Now, will you have an answer if this pawn gets attacked? Rook h3. And now, with a little bit of effort, you guys should start understanding that maneuver. Rook e8, knight d7, bishop f8, bishop g7, knight f8. Okay, now how to break through. Actually, in Rusa's game, if I ever have the time, I'll show her opponent actually played this same idea, f5. What is the idea? Pretty simple. You need to open these lines at some point. So you're either going to push all the way through and cramp black on the dark squares, leave the pawn there, and eventually take on either side to open the light squares, or let black take you and weaken the structure. It creates an enormous amount of tension on the board. It's very easy for me to talk about these moves sitting in front of a microphone, not having to play this stuff. But I can assure you, if you're playing black, and I'll tell you what, let me do this for you. Let's flip it. Isn't it amazing? It's such a drastic difference when you take a hedgehog position and flip it, you know, because now you see that you're confined to these three ranks. And if you don't know these maneuvers that the masters who play the hedgehog know, you will get crushed. So as a student, understand, if I don't have space, try to trade some pieces, which will give you breathing room and reduce the attack. If you have the space, you probably want to avoid the trades and then try to catch black when they're not quite maneuvering properly. It kind of sets up the battle for each team. Okay, so I'm going to flip the board back to the white side, but before I do, the defensive maneuver here played by black is very interesting. They give up this dark squared bishop by taking on c3. And in the game, another common tactic by white is to not take back right away, but to push forward. And by pushing forward, you create a position where there are mating threats on the g7 square. You can see the queen coming in here, and this bishop is now cut off. So black has to do something. So giving up the bishop, Cramling knows she has to play h5. And she's willing to do that. White gets the piece back because, as we discussed in class, after h5, if you take en passant, you're going to allow black to blockade. And now when you take the pawn back, they can sink a knight into a square like e5. White still has a ton of space, and it's a little shaky for black, but little by little you can appreciate that black is putting up quite a fortress. These are white's pawns. So let me flip the board again. Let your eyes focus, and you realize that your own pawns are blockaded and stopping you from attacking. Hopefully that'll give black enough time to get on his or her feet. Okay? Let's go back. So Cramling gives up the bishop. There's the in-between move. There's the en passant, which never happened. You take back. From here, the game ended pretty quickly, but it really shouldn't have. After knight e5, white went to get rid of this piece, which is, probably black's best piece, but for more than one reason. If you could ever take something on this square and force a black pawn here, that would keep the bishop off of this line, and that might give white enough time to organize this sacrifice, which is actually something that happened in the game. So after bishop to d4, white decides to get rid of the knight, blockade the e-pawn, sack over here, and black says no and sinks the knight into g4. It may have been possible to put the knight on c4, followed by, let's say you go for the sacrifice idea by the move e5, which hits the bishop and hits the rook, and now black's pieces are starting to end up on decent squares. By putting it on g4, the idea was to avoid the trade and also to cover these dark squares so that when you do play e5, you'll have a chance to maybe trade for this bishop. Okay, can you guys see all that? Okay, that's why this mysterious king h1 move happens a lot in games like this. King h1 is designed, if you do kick my bishop, I can tuck it into this square over here. Okay, so after king h1, black starts to drift and plays knight h7. Looks like a reasonable move. Everything seems to be held, but the future of the knight looks a little kind of shaky there. Maybe just to counter sacrifice at some point. But here, black gets out of the way, threatening to take, and then jumping in with the queen. Knight goes to e5, and then comes that trade that we talked about. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and now with this dark squared bishop shut off of this line, it gave white enough time for the following maneuver. Bishop went to b7, and now just the sacrifice. And after the sack, the question is, can black hang on after this move? And I think Cramling was banking on white taking this pawn too quickly, and that would have allowed this bishop to take on e4 with a check, and then also being able to tuck itself in here, covering up. But white found a really nice move, rook to e1, which defended the pawn, and at that point she really couldn't hold off the attack. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you something in the video, in the blog rather, from the end of this game, which will give you a nice little tactical exercise. Okay? All right. I will see you grandmasters in class. And if you have any questions about these moves or maneuvers, bring them in. Okay? I'll see you guys Sunday.